This is Robert Landau, Live Life Well TV host with another episode of a show on this channel that we call America's Greatest Personalities. This episode, we're going to focus on the iconic, truly one-of-a-kind Miss Joan Crawford. Stay tuned if you dare. The great Joan Crawford once said these words, "I never go outside unless I look like Joan Crawford, the movie star. If you want to see the girl next door, go next door." She also said, "I think that the most important thing a woman can have, next to talent, of course, is her hairdresser." She also said this, "I was born in front of a camera and really don't know how to do anything else." Ms. Crawford also said there was a saying around MGM, Norma Shearer got the productions, Greta Garbo supplied the art, and Joan Crawford made the money to pay for both. Ms. Crawford also said, "I didn't get where I am following the mundane habits of the masses." She also said, and I love this, "The secret for serenity is just believing." She was born Lucille Fay LeSueur, that's L, small e, capital S-U-E-U-R, and she was born on May 25th, 1905 in San Antonio, Texas. Lucille was bitten by the show business bug early in her life. It is said that she also had a very, very difficult and abusive childhood. We could do a whole presentation just on that, but suffice it to say that she really did not have it easy, which is why she might have been attracted to show business. So many are to make lives better for themselves. As a little girl, she wanted to be a dancer. Even at an early age, she was determined with a capital D. How so? Well, get this. If she wanted something bad enough, she would get it. End of story. That would be that. And because of her iron will and determination, Lucille soon found herself dancing in theater companies, but she made her big jumps to motion pictures in 1925 when MGM offered her a contract at $75 a week. How incredible this must have been for her. Think of it, all your hopes and dreams, even as a young girl, finally start to become a reality, a lifeline, a lifesaver from her horrible childhood. Lucille might have thought that she finally made it, but she was extremely upset because she didn't like the types of parts, even though they were minuscule, that she was getting from MGM. She also wanted the leads in many of the films at that time, but for now, that was just not to be. What would you do if you wanted to have bigger and better, meatier parts in motion pictures that were assigned to you if you were a part of MGM at this time, if you were under contract to them? Of course, you would want stuff that you felt was perfect for you, that would elevate you to stardom and then superstardom. That question, those ideas, were exactly what Lucille was thinking about and had to deal with if she was actually going to make a name for herself. So what would you do? Here is what she did. She knew that she had to get noticed, and that's something that you would do too. You had to stand out from everybody else who was under contract. It was kind of like a competitive vibe. What would be unique about you that the studio heads would take notice of and remember enough to want to give you good roles in MGM pictures. So here is what she decided to do. She decided to promote herself as a flapper. Think of it. It was the 1920s. That would be perfect. She could dance. She figured she had the rest of what it took to be a flapper. She was very good looking. So, you know what? MGM sat up and noticed her. They also decided to change her name, which probably was a good idea since Le Sueur sounded very similar to Le Sueur, S-E-W-E-R. MGM decided to let the public pick her screen name, which was a very good marketing ploy if you think about it. So a national contest was held. The name Joan Arden was selected, but sounded very similar to another actress with very much the same name. My guess would be Eve Arden, but not quite sure about that. So Crawford was substituted. And you know what? Joan wanted her first name to actually be Joanne. And okay, she could deal with Joan, but she absolutely hated the name Crawford. Why? Because she thought it sounded too much like crawfish. I kind of get that. But the studio won out, as they often would, and Lucille's screen name became Joan Crawford. So there you have it. Joan was cast as a struggling chorus girl in a 1925 film by the name of Sally, Irene, and Mary. More films would follow, as each one would bring Joan closer to the movie star status that she was craving. And yeah, maybe this was a little bit of an ego thing, but think of the line of business she was in, and you were in a sea of competition. So I can understand her drive, her wanting to be a true bona fide star. And maybe not even that. Maybe it was to be a true bona fide superstar. And why not? In 1927, she made a film with Lon Chaney Sr. that was called The Unknown. Joan would later say that she learned more from watching Lon Chaney Sr. act than any other male she would ever star with. Now that was really saying something. In these early roles, Crawford won many female fans, as the roles that she would play would be a perfect representation of the free-spirited American woman of the 1920s. Joan would end up marrying dashing actor Douglas Fairbanks Jr. in 1929. The only thing is that the Fairbanks family happened to be violently opposed to the marriage and for many years wouldn't even speak to the newlywed couple. The situation eventually changed. What did all the pictures that Joan Crawford make up until this moment in time have in common? Well, they were all silent films. So when the leap came from silent to talkies, of course, Joan wanted to be on the crest of that wave, and this would occur in 1929. It was a picture called Untamed. Her co-star would be Robert Montgomery. Crawford's next films would help establish her as what was then known as the Queen of the Movies. That's a pretty cool title if you wanted to be that. In 1931, she made a film with Clark Gable called Possessed, and she would end up having an affair with Gable that the studio happened to be violently opposed to. Gable decided to end the affair, but many speculate to this day that the couple carried on in secret for many years. You know, in those days, and I'm not telling you anything new, if you were under contract to a studio, they were yours personally and professionally. More films would follow for Joan, including the extremely popular Grand Hotel. Joan and Fairbanks Jr. would now end up going through a very nasty, very publicized divorce. Crawford would then meet an actor by the name of Franco Tone. They would get married, but then end up divorcing 4 years later. After more films, Joan ended up adopting her first daughter in 1940, and I bet you remember what her name was. Christina. Joan would marry once again, and the couple would adopt a boy by the name of Philip Terry Jr. Philip Terry Sr. was the gentleman Joan would marry at this point in time. When that marriage would end in divorce, Joan would change Philip's name to Christopher. Joan's contract with MGM would end in 1943 after an amazing, very lucrative and productive 18-year run. I mean, what a great thing MGM was for Joan. It literally gave her what she was so longing for on a silver platter. Was it easy for her to get to where she wanted to be? No. Something like that for anyone is not easy. She fought her way to the top, tooth and nail, but got there. But now she would sign with Warner Brothers for $500,000 in a lucrative 3-picture deal. One of Joan's main reasons for signing with Warner Brothers was the fact that they wanted her to play, and she wanted to play the part of Mattie in a film called Ethan Frome. Somebody by the name of Bette Davis, who also just happened to be at Warner Brothers, wanted that same role and ended up literally telling the big wigs at Warner Brothers Studios that, quote, Joan's far too old to play the role, and besides, she can't act, unquote. If you want to see our tribute to Bette Davis, go back a couple of episodes in this series on this channel and you will find our presentation on Bette Davis there. Davis also wanted to play the role of Mildred Pierce, but ended up turning the role down, which then, as you probably know, went to Joan. The film became one of Joan's greatest successes for her amazing acting skills in that film. Joan would win the much coveted Academy Award that year. Let's not even talk, because that's going to be like 8 episodes of the feud that existed between Joan Crawford and Bette Davis. As a matter of fact, speaking of that word feud, you might want to check this out if you haven't seen it already. There was a mini-series, just, I don't know, I'm guessing about 3 or 4 years ago, and I think it was on the FX cable channel, called Feud. And it had like 8 parts to it. It's a mini-series called Feud. And it was all about the real-life feud between those two stars. An amazing miniseries, so true to the period. Amazing acting, too. Susan Sarandon played Bette Davis. Jessica Lange played Joan Crawford, and she looked just like her. Do try to see the miniseries Feud. It would be well worth your while. More hit films would follow for Joan, and now she could claim the title as being one of the most popular actresses ever. 2 more Academy Awards would be given for her amazing acting efforts. Joan would marry one more time. You might remember this one or have heard of it. It was back in 1955 to a gentleman by the name of Jack Steele. Steele was president of Pepsi Cola. Joan would serve on the board of Pepsi Cola after Steele's passing, and just before going back to films. By the 1960s, Joan would find that her box office appeal for motion pictures, unfortunately, was starting to sour. People just weren't interested in her films any longer or seeing her in films any longer. Then there would be a film that would revive her sagging career. That film was the iconic Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. Her co-star, Bette Davis. The two actresses, to say the least, tried their best to be civil during the filming, and for the most part, they were. But when they weren't, oh boy, weren't they. Television would follow for Joan. One of Joan's appearances would be on an episode of The Lucy Show with Lucille Ball. You can still see a clip of that episode on YouTube. Just do a YouTube search for Joan Crawford on the Lucille Ball Show. You will see Lucille Ball and Vivian Vance knock on the door of Joan Crawford's palatial mansion in Beverly Hills, not knowing whose mansion it was, and I think they might have gotten lost or they needed someone to call a taxi for them. It's a great scene, and Joan does real well on a sitcom. Although there were tensions between Ball and Crawford in the rehearsals for that episode, the studio audience ended up giving Joan 2 standing ovations the day of that taping. It was clear that Joan's film days were now over, as was most of her career, but wow, what an amazing, astounding career it was. In the span of no less than 45 years, Joan Crawford would make over 80 motion pictures. The 1970s saw less of Joan when she saw photos in various newspapers and magazines of herself after attending a benefit for her dear friend Rosalind Russell in 1974. She was horrified at how she looked because she was seeing the paparazzi photos in newspapers and magazines. She said, if that is how I look, then they won't see me anymore. She remained true to her word. The world rarely saw anything more of the great Joan Crawford after those very words were spoken. Remember that iron will and determination? Well, it could work in that instance as well. She lived a very quiet and sad life in her New York City apartment and rarely came out. 2 days after giving up her beloved dog, which she could no longer care for, Joan Crawford died alone in her apartment on May 10th, 1977. The great Joan Crawford was 72 years of age. In her will, she left some of her vast fortune to her 2 youngest adopted children. She actually had 4 altogether that she had adopted. No money was given to her 2 oldest adopted children, Christina and Christopher. Joan's will read, and I quote, "It is my intention to make no provision herein for my son Christopher or my daughter Christina for reasons which are well known to them." Unquote. A year and a half after Joan's death, Christina Crawford's famous book, Mommy Dearest, was published. No one really knows if the many allegations that Christina Crawford mentions in her book and the film that you might have seen with Faye Dunaway made from the book are actually true. Many of Joan's friends deny any and all of the accusations. Bette Davis said at the time that Christina must have been telling the truth. The truth and mystery of one of the greatest stars of all time will probably remain just that, a mystery. And maybe that's where they need to stay. We do know that Joan Crawford was an incredibly determined, talented, and strong-willed human being. Joan still stands as a role model for women's rights and issues when it comes to many of her film roles. They are iconic classics in that way and provide a mentoring energy in that way too. Joan also stands for knowing that if it's something that you really want, go for it. Ask for it, and it shall be given to you in some way, shape, or form. Maybe what one does in one's personal life, even if you happen to be a true star and major public personality, should, as I just said before, remain private. The sad thing about the show business industry now, as it started to be back then, was that there was no separation between one's personal and public life. Before Joan Crawford, Betty Davis, and the like, you never really knew what Hollywood stars were like and what they were doing, feeling, and thinking in their personal lives. Nowadays, as it started to be back then, it wasn't easy to be a public figure. Today, very much the same case. And such is the life of the great Joan Crawford. So, hope you learned a couple of things that you didn't know about this iconic lady. And with that, I will take my leave of you now and thank you so much for tuning in. This has been Robert Landau, Live Life Well TV host. Check out all the episodes of America's Greatest Personalities we have just for you here on Live Life Well TV, as well as 4 other different series of shows. Thanks for tuning in. God bless.